Avoidants don't stop because you confront them. They stop because you become unpredictable. Avoidants don't fold under confrontation. They don't change because you call them out, raise your voice, or demand clarity. If anything, confrontation reinforces their instinct to retreat. What actually disarms an avoidant, what stops the mind games instantly, is when you shift from predictable emotional responses to something they never prepared for, unpredictability, rooted in self control. Mind games thrive in environments where your reactions can be anticipated. The avoidant keeps you close enough to feel wanted, distant enough to feel safe, and confused enough to stay engaged. This only works when they know how you'll respond. They expect you to reach out when they pull back, to explain yourself when they withdraw, to offer reassurance when they go emotionally cold. They rely on that pattern. They count on it. It's the script they've been running for years. But when you stop following the script, the entire game falls apart. Suddenly, the avoidant can't read you. They can't predict what comes next. They can't calculate your emotions or gauge your availability. And for someone who uses distance as control, unpredictability becomes the one thing they cannot play with. The moment you stop reacting, you change the rules without announcing it. You stop chasing answers. You stop filling in their silences. You stop responding to the crumbs of affection they throw to keep you emotionally hooked. Instead, you shift into a calm, unbothered, self-contained version of yourself. And that's when the avoidant feels the ground move beneath them. They're used to you being emotionally accessible. They're used to you being the stabilizer, the initiator, the one who smooths the tension they create. When you stop doing that, the power dynamic resets instantly. Your unpredictability isn't about playing games back. It's about stepping out of the game altogether. It's you choosing presence without pursuit, communication without over-explaining, silence without fear. You are no longer predictable in the old ways. You're not angry, but you're not available. You're not cold, but you're not chasing. You're not punishing them, but you're not rewarding their inconsistency either. This shift forces the avoidant into unfamiliar emotional territory. Without your predictable reactions, they can't regulate the distance. They don't know if you're leaving, moving on, or simply refusing to play along. And that uncertainty is what makes their mind games lose all effectiveness. When you become unpredictable in a grounded, peaceful way, you take away the only leverage their avoidance ever had, your emotional predictability. That is when the mind games stop. Not because they suddenly mature or gain awareness, but because the tactic no longer works. When the pattern collapses, the avoidant is left exposed. Either they step up and meet you where you are, or they fade back into the distance, realizing they can't control what they can't predict. The moment you break the emotional routine, their strategy breaks with it. Avoidants don't operate randomly. Their behavior follows a deeply ingrained emotional routine. They pull back when things feel close, they return when things feel safe, and they test your emotional temperature to confirm you're still willing to carry the weight of connection for both of you. This routine is predictable, not because they consciously plan it, but because it's the only relationship rhythm they know. They depend on your emotional consistency to maintain it. If you're always the one initiating conversations, soothing their anxiety, reconnecting after their distance, or giving clarity when they create confusion, then their strategy functions perfectly. Your emotional availability becomes the foundation they build their avoidance on. But the moment you break that routine, even slightly, everything inside their system begins to malfunction. When you stop responding the way you always have, their emotional calculations stop adding up. They don't know when to retreat because you're not stepping forward. They don't know when to return because you're no longer holding the door open. They don't know when to play distant because your energy no longer fills the entire space. And for the first time, the avoidant feels disruption in their internal safety pattern. This disruption is not caused by you being cold or cruel. It's caused by you no longer feeding the emotional loop that kept the dynamic predictable. Avoidants don't expect you to change. They expect you to do exactly what you've always done, over-understand, over-give, over-apologize, over-stabilize. When you step back from that role, their mind games lose their structure. Their distance stops having impact. Their silence stops provoking you. Their mixed signals stop pulling you in. The routine they relied on becomes ineffective because the emotional constant, you, is no longer predictable. And that's when their strategy collapses. They have nothing to push against, nothing to pull toward, nothing to manipulate through uncertainty. The emotional leverage they held disappears the moment you remove your participation in the old dance. Breaking the routine doesn't mean you become disinterested or disconnected. It means you become self-directed. You shift from reacting to leading your own emotional rhythm. Instead of waiting for their next move, you make decisions based on your own peace. Instead of adjusting yourself to maintain harmony, you hold your ground and let the chips fall where they may. This shift throws the avoidant off balance because they've only ever functioned in relationships where the other person compensates for their emotional absence. Now, when you don't rush to soothe, they must sit with their own discomfort. When you don't initiate after their withdrawal, they must confront their own insecurity. When you don't rebuild the connection after they disrupt it, they must acknowledge they were the one who broke it. And that's the moment their strategy loses its power. Because without your emotional consistency, there is no strategy left to hide behind. The entire routine dissolves, and the avoidant is forced to either rise to a new dynamic or lose access to the one person who ever made connection feel possible. Silence is the one language an avoidant never trained for. Avoidants can handle almost anything: distance, emotional tension, mixed signals, withdrawal, even your frustration. But what they never learn to navigate is silence. Not the silent treatment, not punishment, not manipulation, but the silence that comes from finally understanding your own worth. The silence that happens when you stop trying to fix what they keep breaking. The silence that arrives when you choose yourself, not as a reaction, but as a decision. This type of silence hits differently. It doesn't attack them. It doesn't chase them. It doesn't pull them in or push them away. It just removes you from the emotional battlefield entirely. And that is the one environment an avoidant is unprepared for. You stop explaining yourself, and suddenly they don't have your clarity to hide behind. You stop narrating your feelings, and they no longer know where you stand. You stop overgiving, and the imbalance they relied on collapses. You stop proving your worth, and they have to confront why they never felt worthy of it in the first place. This is where the power shifts instantly, because silence forces the avoidant to engage with the one thing they've been running from their entire lives, their own internal world. Your silence removes their emotional shortcut. You're no longer cushioning their fears or interpreting their behavior. You're no longer giving them the reassurance that you'll always be there, no matter how inconsistent they are. You're no longer filling in the gaps they create with their distance. When you go silent, the avoidant loses the emotional feedback loop they depended on. For the first time, they're left alone with the consequences of their patterns, and it unsettles them more than any argument ever could. Avoidants expect your words. They expect explanations, apologies, and emotional openness. That's the role they silently assigned you. When you stop playing that role, they can't read you anymore. Silence becomes a mirror, a painfully clear one, showing them the emptiness created by their own avoidance. It's not that they suddenly become secure or self-aware, but they begin to feel the discomfort of the void, the space where your effort used to be, the effort they always took for granted. Your silence does not punish them, it exposes them. It exposes the truth that connection only worked because you kept holding it together. It reveals that the emotional bond was sustained by your effort, not theirs. It forces them to see how much they relied on you to regulate the relationship, the communication, and even their own insecurity. In the moment they realize the silence isn't temporary, that you're not withdrawing to get a reaction, but choosing peace, something in them shifts. They understand that the version of you who explained, reassured, stayed patient, and carried the connection is no longer accessible. Silence is not your weakness, it's your boundary. And it's the one thing the avoidant never prepared themselves to face. When you stop trying to understand them, they're forced to understand themselves. Avoidants depend on being misunderstood, not because they enjoy confusion, but because confusion protects them. As long as you're busy trying to decode their behavior, interpret their silence, or soften their emotional distance, they never have to look inward. Your effort becomes their escape. Your empathy becomes their shield. Your understanding becomes the perfect hiding place for everything they're unwilling to confront. But the moment you stop trying to understand them, the moment you stop explaining their behavior back to them, something shifts. Suddenly, the emotional weight they've been placing on you slides back into their hands, and they are forced to sit with the truth they've been running from. Their patterns only worked because you participated in them. Mind games aren't random. They are defense mechanisms, distractions from their insecurities, fears, and emotional wounds. When you stop trying to understand why they ghosted, why they pulled back, why they switched from warm to cold in a single breath, you remove the psychological cover their behavior relied on. Your disengagement means you're no longer cushioning their emotional discomfort. You're no longer helping them make sense of their own avoidance. You're no longer giving them the emotional interpretation they never learned to give themselves. And this is where the internal reckoning begins. Avoidants expect you to fill the silence, to soothe the distance, to interpret their mixed signals, to stabilize the connection they destabilize. That's the unspoken agreement they form with emotionally generous people. But when you stop trying to understand them, they're confronted with the reality that you're no longer willing to act as their emotional translator. Now, when they withdraw, they feel the emptiness of their own walls. When they sabotage connection, they feel the consequence instead of your recovery. When they create distance, they face the loneliness it brings, not the reassurance you used to rush in with. Your disengagement forces them to see that connection doesn't maintain itself, and that their behavior isn't just a reaction to fear. It's the reason intimacy keeps slipping through their fingers. For possibly the first time, the avoidant begins to feel the impact of their patterns from the outside, not just the inside. Without you interpreting their motives, they have to examine them. Without you absorbing their inconsistency, they have to acknowledge it. Without you over understanding, they have to recognize how little they've understood themselves. And that realization can be jarring because it exposes the truth. They weren't in control. They were in avoidance. They weren't protecting the relationship. They were protecting their fear. They weren't emotionally unavailable. They were emotionally unprepared. When you stop trying to understand them, you take back the emotional responsibility that was never yours. You stand firm in your clarity instead of bending into theirs. And in doing so, you create the space for them to confront themselves. Not because you demanded it, but because your absence of effort reveals the work they've never done. This is where growth begins. And it's where their mind games end. You shut the game down. The moment you stop chasing. Avoidants survive on ambiguity. It's their safest terrain, their emotional shield, the place where they can stay half in and half out without ever fully committing to the vulnerability that real connection requires. Ambiguity allows them to keep you close enough to feel wanted, but far enough to avoid emotional exposure. And as long as you're chasing clarity, asking what went wrong, wondering where you stand, trying to decode their mixed signals, they remain in control. Because every question you ask, every explanation you seek, every attempt to understand their behavior pulls you deeper into their rhythm of uncertainty. Their silence becomes a hook. Their distance becomes a lure. Their inconsistency becomes a cycle you keep trying to solve. But the moment you stop chasing clarity, the entire game collapses. When you no longer need answers from them, they lose the emotional leverage ambiguity once gave them. They can't dangle explanations in front of you. They can't weaponize confusion. They can't use unpredictability to keep you emotionally engaged. You stepping out of the pursuit disrupts the very foundation their avoidance depends on, because avoidance only works when someone is actively trying to understand it. Without your effort, their ambiguity becomes meaningless. It has nothing to control, nothing to destabilize, nothing to confuse. Avoidants expect people to lean in when they pull back. They expect you to fill in the blanks. They expect you to seek reassurance when they go quiet. They expect you to initiate clarity when they create tension. That's the routine they rely on, often unconsciously. So when you stop seeking clarity, they are forced to confront the truth. Without your pursuit, there is no emotional movement. The relationship doesn't progress. The tension doesn't resolve. The dynamic doesn't reset. Everything just stops. And that stillness is where their strategy breaks apart. By no longer asking for answers, You show them you're no longer dependent on their explanations. You no longer need their validation, their labeling of the connection, or their emotional breadcrumbs to feel grounded. You detach from the cycle that once held you captive, and in doing so, you expose the reality that the avoidant never had control. You were simply giving them emotional power by seeking clarity. They were never prepared to give. When you stop asking, they start wondering. When you stop seeking, they start questioning. When you stop chasing clarity, they are left alone with the inconsistencies they used to hide behind confusion. And for the first time, they may feel the discomfort of their own emotional distance instead of relying on yours to compensate for it. Your surrender of the chase shows them the consequences of their behavior in a way words never could. It holds up a mirror they can no longer avoid. You shutting down the pursuit of clarity is not you giving up. It's you rising above the chaos. It's the moment you choose peace over confusion. And it's the moment their mind games lose their oxygen and finally, quietly die out. Emotional neutrality is something avoidants never see coming. They're prepared for your frustration because anger lets them retreat without guilt. They're prepared for your neediness because it reinforces their belief that closeness is overwhelming. They're even prepared for confrontation because conflict justifies their distance. But what they are absolutely not prepared for is calm detachment, the quiet middle ground where you're no longer emotionally reactive, no longer chasing, no longer pleading, and no longer trying to pull the relationship out of the chaos they created. Neutrality confuses them because it removes every emotional cue they relied on to navigate the dynamic. It's the one state where their avoidance has nothing to push against and nothing to run from. Neutrality is not indifference. It's not coldness. It's not shutting down. It's simply shifting from being emotionally driven to being emotionally balanced. It's choosing not to overinvest or underinvest. It's responding instead of reacting. It's showing up for yourself without demanding they show up for you. And that stability is what disrupts their entire pattern. Avoidants thrive on emotional extremes, the highs that make them feel wanted and the lows that justify their withdrawal. But when you exist in the middle, steady and unbothered, their tactics lose all impact. They can pull away and you won't collapse. They can become inconsistent and you won't chase. They can go silent and you won't panic. Your neutrality teaches them that emotional power only existed when you let it. This state of calm detachment forces them to experience something new, emotional accountability. When you're not escalating, explaining, overfeeling, or overgiving, they can't hide behind their usual reasoning. They can't blame your intensity. They can't claim they feel pressured. They can't say they needed space because you were too much. Your neutrality removes every excuse. Now, when they pull back, they feel the distance they created. When they go cold, they feel the disconnect. When they disappear, they feel the absence, not your reaction to it. That's why neutrality is their kryptonite. It shifts the consequence back where it belongs. Avoidants don't fear your feelings. They fear their own. And your neutrality brings them face to face with emotions they've spent years avoiding: discomfort, uncertainty, insecurity, and even longing. Without your emotional turbulence to distract them, they have to sit with what they feel instead of running from it. They have to recognize their pattern instead of hiding behind it. They have to see you clearly, the calm, centered version of you they can no longer control or predict. And here's the quiet truth: neutrality isn't what makes them pull away. It's what finally makes them see the cost of pulling away. It shows them that that emotional safety they relied on was never guaranteed. It shows them that your steadiness wasn't weakness. It was generosity. It shows them that they didn't lose you because you were too emotional, but because you stopped feeding into a pattern that never honored your heart. Calm detachment ends the cycle not with noise, but with clarity. And that clarity is the one thing an avoidant has never learned to navigate. Avoidants don't fear losing you, they fear losing their influence over how you feel. As long as your emotions orbit their behavior, they feel a sense of psychological control. When you react to their distance, when you overthink their silence, when you question your worth because of their inconsistency, they can stretch your energy when they want closeness, shrink it when they feel overwhelmed, or disappear from it when their fear gets too loud. But everything changes the moment you become uninterested, not angry, not resentful, not heartbroken, simply uninterested. The moment your emotional world stops rotating around them, their ability to manipulate the dynamic collapses instantly. Uninterested doesn't mean you stop caring as a human. It means you stop investing in things that don't invest back. You stop trying to decode their mixed signals. You stop wondering why they ghosted. You stop chasing clarity, validation, or emotional crumbs. You stop tying your self-worth to their behavior. Your emotional energy becomes yours again. And avoidants don't know how to manage a version of you they can't sway. When you become uninterested, you stop giving them the reactions that once fed the entire push-pull dynamic. You don't lean in when they pull away. You don't soften when they return with half effort. You don't adjust yourself to make them feel safer. You don't interpret their inconsistency as depth. You see things clearly, and clarity kills the illusion they once had control over. Avoidants rely on the idea that you'll always be there, that no matter how far they retreat, you'll wait, that no matter how confusing they become, you'll try harder, that no matter how inconsistent they act, your heart will continue showing up at full capacity. They're not prepared for the moment that stops. When your energy no longer responds to their emotional fluctuations, they lose their sense of power. Suddenly, their silence doesn't pull you in, their distance doesn't destabilize you, their return doesn't excite you, their mixed signals don't confuse you. You simply don't engage with the behavior anymore because you've outgrown the version of yourself that once did. And that's what makes you unmanipulatable. Your energy is no longer accessible to them. They can't stretch it, they can't shrink it, they can't disappear from it because you no longer offer it freely. It's not that you block them out, it's that you no longer bend for them. You're not cold, you're not dramatic, you're just uninterested in participating in patterns that keep breaking you. And that neutrality, that quiet indifference, is what finally exposes their own emotional fragility. For the first time, they feel the gap they created, not the reaction you used to get. Becoming uninterested isn't losing love, it's gaining self-respect. And once you reach that level, the avoidant finally understands that the real loss was never yours. It was theirs. Avoidants don't stop playing because they suddenly grow up, gain emotional maturity, or have an awakening. They stop when they realize the game can't continue without you participating in it. The push-pull dynamic, the distance, the silence, the mixed signals, all of it depends on your emotional availability, on your reactions, on your hope, on your willingness to keep showing up, even when they disappear. But when you stop being the player and become the boundary, everything changes immediately. You're no longer waiting for their texts, reacting to their silences, or decoding signals they never intended to clarify. You step out of the emotional maze entirely, and that is when the avoidant finally realizes the rules have changed permanently. Becoming the boundary means you no longer allow emotional inconsistency into your space. You don't negotiate with instability, you don't romanticize confusion, you don't chase someone who feels safer running. You choose clarity, not because you demand it from them, but because you generate it within yourself. When you do this, you shift from being someone whose emotions can be pulled, pushed, stretched, or paused to someone who stands firm, calm, unmoved, self-directed. Avoidants don't know how to deal with that. They're used to partners who over-accommodate, who try harder when things get hard, who fill in emotional gaps, who accept breadcrumbs because they can sense the potential beneath the distance. But boundaries don't bend for potential. Boundaries respond to reality. So you begin responding to what is not what you hope it could be. If they pull back, you don't pull forward. If they go silent, you don't break the silence. If they send mixed signals, you don't untangle them. If they disappear, you let the space speak for itself. Your boundary becomes the final rule of the game, and it's a rule they didn't expect. Avoidants assume that they can always return to the emotional safety you provide, even if they only offer half effort in return. They assume your patience is endless, your empathy is bottomless, your forgiveness is guaranteed. They assume you'll adjust yourself to their fears. But when your boundary becomes non negotiable, that assumption collapses. They don't get unlimited access to you anymore. They don't get to decide the timing, the pace, or the emotional tone of the connection. Suddenly the power shifts because you're no longer operating on their terms. This doesn't make you cold, it makes you conscious. It doesn't make you distant, it makes you self-respecting. It doesn't make you difficult, it makes you unavailable to dysfunction. And that new version of you is the one version an avoidant cannot manipulate, confuse, or destabilize. A boundary is something they cannot push through. It's something they must either rise to meet or lose access to. When you stop playing the game, when you become the boundary, the dynamic resets. And when they realize the door isn't locked, it's simply no longer wide open. That's when the avoidant finally understands that their patterns don't control you anymore. Avoidants don't panic when you walk away. They panic when you stop responding the way you used to. Because for them, emotional access was never about communication. It was about control, not abusive control, but emotional predictability. They counted on you being available, understanding, patient, always the one who bridged the gap, soothed the silence, and softened the distance. And when they pulled back, you reached forward. When they shut down, you opened up even more. When they became confusing, you tried even harder to understand. That version of you, the version who tolerated their defensive patterns, made them feel safe without ever having to step into vulnerability. But something changes the moment you stop participating in that cycle. It doesn't happen loudly. It doesn't happen cruelly. It doesn't even happen with revenge in your heart. It happens with clarity. You stop chasing clarity from someone who communicates with confusion. You stop negotiating connection with someone who only shows up when it's convenient. You stop explaining your needs to someone who pretends not to understand them. Your emotional door doesn't slam shut. It simply stops staying propped open. And that's when the avoidant feels something they're not used to, a shift in the dynamic they thought was permanent. Because what really scares an avoidant isn't the loss of the relationship. It's losing their emotional advantage. It's realizing they no longer have the version of you who excused their pull away, romanticized their distance, or explained away their inconsistency. When you step out of the emotional maze they created, the gay men, suddenly their silence isn't powerful. It's irrelevant. Their inconsistency no longer destabilizes you. Their mixed signals no longer pull you back in. Your calm becomes the loudest message you've ever sent. And that's the moment they freeze, because they're not used to you being neutral, detached, centered, unreachable, not because you're playing a game, but because you're finally respecting yourself. Avoidants often don't realize they've crossed a boundary until the other person stops giving them emotional oxygen. Your absence isn't what wakes them up. Your self-respect is. And when the avoidant senses that shift, that loss of inner access, their mind games lose their purpose. There's nothing to trigger, nothing to manipulate, nothing to avoid, because the emotional version of you they depended on no longer exists. Not out of anger, but evolution. And once you evolve into someone who no longer entertains emotional uncertainty, you become someone they can no longer play with and someone they can no longer forget. Avoidants don't fear conflict. They fear clarity because clarity reveals patterns and patterns reveal intentions. And nothing brings more clarity than peaceful detachment. You don't yell. You don't chase. You don't demand explanations. They never plan to give. You simply pull your energy back quietly, calmly, confidently, and suddenly the entire dynamic shifts. Avoidants thrive in emotional fog, distance, mixed signals, silence, push-pull. These tactics only work when you're still emotionally invested, still reacting, still trying to decode their behavior. But when you detach with peace, the fog lifts, the pattern becomes obvious, the game becomes visible, and they can no longer hide behind their favorite defense. I'm not doing anything wrong. Because now you see everything clearly. You see how their silence wasn't confusion, it was control. How their distance wasn't overwhelm, it was avoidance. How their inconsistency wasn't accidental, it was a shield. Your peace becomes the mirror they never wanted to look into. They're used to you filling the silence, soothing the tension, restoring the connection. Your emotional labor kept the dynamic alive, and your empathy made their avoidance feel less damaging than it actually was. When you step back, truly step back, their strategy collapses. They can't guilt you. They can't breadcrumb you. They can't pull you back with minimal effort. They can't rely on your heart to keep bridging a gap. They kept widening because you're no longer in the place where their tactics used to work. And that's when something surprising happens. They stop using them. Not because they've grown, not because they suddenly understand your worth, but because their tactics only function when they have emotional access to you. Peaceful detachment takes that access away. It exposes what their distance was really protecting. Fear of intimacy, fear of vulnerability, fear of being seen fully. You never punished them. You just stopped participating. And the moment you stop participating in the avoidant cycle, they either have to meet you at a healthier level or lose the dynamic they depended on. Avoidants often mistake your affection for weakness until your silence shows them your strength. Because peace is the one thing they can't fight, can't manipulate, can't run from. It reveals the truth. They didn't lose you by accident. They lost you because their old ways could not survive the version of you who finally chose clarity over confusion, boundaries over chaos, peace over patterns. And once an empath detaches with peace, there is no going back for them or the avoidant who now realizes exactly what they exposed.